Okay, as I stated earlier, we're going to have two sessions dealing with the return to school. First one's going to focus more on the emotional aspect and the anxiety that's in the air, and the second one's going to really dive into the academics and the implications of virtual learning for all different ages. So the first one with Jeannie Goodman will be today, and then if you tune in next Friday, I believe that's the time, it'll be Alex Meisler, and she's an academic expert who will again take us through the academics of virtual schooling. Now Carissa has joined us. I can ask her about her kids' schooling while we wait for Jeannie, but let's just give Jeannie a minute to get on. Mm-hmm. I don't know if everyone started school yet, but it's a lot of different options out there. Let's see. Hello to Carissa as well. All right, let's try it. Okay, just give Dr. Goodman a minute and we should be all set. Ah, perfect. That's wonderful.
Yes.
So now all we got to do is turn it. Now we're all
Okay.
set to go. Perfect.
Okay.
Okay, great. So anyway, I'm here with Dr. Jeannie Goodman. She's a psychiatrist who works in Park Slope, and she's just a wonderful psychiatrist, but she's also just a tremendous friend to our practice. And whenever we have questions or referrals, she's always there for us. So I just want to thank you for that. When we started talking about this, today we're going to talk about the return to school and the anxiety that's kind of in the air around the return to school this year. It's funny because I was thinking back to previous years and my own children, and how there's always at the beginning of school a mix between excitement and anxiety, but it's usually kind of kid-centered stuff. It's usually, who's my teacher going to be? Who's going to be in my class? And this year, there's a whole nother layer of anxiety layered on top of it. And as we were talking a little bit yesterday, Jeannie and I were talking, Dr. Goodman and I were talking, and we were talking about who this anxiety is actually affecting, and does it affect the children, or is it more something that we're feeling as parents? So I'm going to let Dr. Goodman talk and kind of get through all this, and then we'll hopefully come up with some ways to understand what's going on now, and then maybe some ideas for how to handle it. So, Jeannie, I'm going to hand you the floor, and I'll chime in if I have any questions.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for these awesome live Instagrams that you're doing, because you're really giving parents a chance to access so much information. And this topic, they really need it. So that's really wonderful. So yes, I'm Jeannie Goodman, and I'm in private practice in Brooklyn, seeing many of your patients and others. And actually, all my training was in New York City, so I'm feeling a lot of New York City pride right now. I went to Mount Sinai, Columbia, NYU, and so I was thinking, when I was going to introduce myself, to just mention, in the midst of so much stress that these kids are witnessing around them, and this pandemic, that I like to tell these kids about the remarkable way the New Yorkers have responded, and just to point to it as like a thing of beauty in the midst of it all. And especially because we're trying to get everybody to adapt and wear masks, and that's a big issue coming up with going back to school. And it's just amazing how New York has adapted. So that's something to point out. But your question about, going back to school, and is it different this year? How is it different? I think we could start with that. And you also touched on parents' anxiety and what role that could play. So I'll start with anxiety this year being a different kind of beast. I mean, there's always, I once had a kid describe the feeling of the jitters before school as nervited. So they combine the word like nervous and excited. So sometimes I use that word. And kids who tend towards separation anxiety, that's often a trickier thing for them to navigate, because you've been home with your parents all summer and now all of a sudden you're separating. So that's an area, I think, this year that might be a little more intense for some kids, and we might even see it in older kids than we normally would. And I think that's because a couple things. The kids have been around more, and for so much longer and in a totally separate routine from school and asked to come back in. So that's just a bigger leap. But also one of the cardinal symptoms of separation anxiety disorder is worrying about safety, worrying about your safety when you're separated from your attachment figure, worrying about your parents. And there's kind of a safety worry in the air. And so we might see a little more of that. But that said, back to the role, that parents play in managing our own anxiety. I think we have to be careful of projecting what we think is going to happen, because some kids might really surprise us this year, just like we as parents are so antsy to get back to normal, and we just want some independence, and we want to have some of these kids who normally might be kind of, like you said, worried about their teacher and their classroom and their friends. They may just be running through those doors. Like they might surprise you and be like happy to return. So if you say things like, "Are you worried about school, sweetie?" or something like that, you might be drawing attention before you really need to. So there's a big, I think, helpful tip in just like what they're bringing up and just following that lead.
Yeah, I found that actually in the exam room that a lot of times parents do project onto their child, but what they're speaking about is something that's not even on their kid's radar. It's more their own sense of the uncertainty of school. So I think it's such an important point to check your own anxiety before you interact with your child.
Yeah, that's interesting that you see that. And then you have that moment to manage. Yeah, so
yeah, exactly.
So another way that this year is different is there was an article, I think, in the New York Times written for adults about how, since we've all been kind of alone usual, that there's almost like an awkwardness when you like get back to interacting with people socially. There's almost like an ice wall that isn't normally there, and you're like, oh, suddenly you're aware of yourself socially in a way that normally you're at ease and you take for granted. So kids are going to have that too. I mean, I know kids who are just like, oh, I'm going to see that friend again that I was so close to, but then we never FaceTimed, and what's that going to be like? So I think some of the social, getting back into the routine might be a little bumpier. Am I breaking up, John?
It's a little bit. I mean, it's a little bit breaking up. I don't know if it's where you are in the place, but it's still a little pixelated. Yeah. Sometimes just moving might do the job.
Let's flip it. How's that?
I mean, again, the visual is a little pixelated, but the audio is coming through.
Okay. Should I just keep going?
I kind of feel like, I mean, everything you're saying is just wonderful. So, it's kind of like those old pictures where they have the old movies.
Yeah.
But
well, if it's not that much better, I'm going to go where I was.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think it'll come in and out. Yeah, but as long as the audio is good, I think we're okay.
Okay. And then I would say we could talk more about this. I don't know if any other questions rolled in, but the academic challenges this year are unique too. And like you were saying, I forget where, maybe just now you were saying it live, but there really are so many different setups for different kids, about a range of people who have no choice and have to do Zoom at home, people who chose to do Zoom at home, people who are doing hybrid, and then people who are back to in-person with all kinds of, new agey, like sci-fi protective things in place. And so that's another, there are a select group of kids who kind of like homeschooling, which is great. But a lot of people find that the lack of structure and the sitting and trying to feel stimulated and get that dopamine flowing to focus when you're kind of staring at a screen is more challenging. So anyway, some ways that it's unique. Yeah.
Are there particular ages that you found have had a harder time? Like is it more the high school kid? I was wondering if there's a certain age where it seems like the social element is so important to be in school.
I guess you could make the argument that for younger kids, and I'm thinking 9 and under, that so much of the frontal cortex isn't yet fully developed, and that's that part of the brain that really helps us impulses, plan, sit still, focus on one thing at a time. They're still, I mean, neurologically, that's why we still talk when we talk in therapy with kids at that age, we use play. You have to grab their attention more. And so that group ultimately is organically struggling more to pay attention by just sitting in their dining room with the screen. I think that's true.
Got it. Interesting. Yeah. And again, you were addressing kind of the social element, which I hadn't thought about, but I'm guessing that's such a big part of school. I don't know if you're seeing that. How you address that with kids, or how ideas that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, do you mean specific? There's so many social issues that have come up throughout the pandemic, like this particular issue of transitioning back to school. I guess I'm seeing it now kind of as we go, but some kids are finding the hybrid, the 1 day a week go in and then come home, kind of reassuring, because like it's not as flooding. You know, when we talk about exposing kids to anxiety, we try to go gradually. We don't want to flood, which means do it all at once. So actually I had one kid who like is finding this really useful because she went in and was able to have a better day knowing that it wasn't going to be the full week of school.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's what I mean. You have to follow these kids because they really will surprise you. But, you know, I guess it really depends on your kid and whether, you know, I guess I would encourage my kid to know that everybody's in the same boat. And everyone might feel a little awkward. Introduce them to the term breaking ice and what that is, and to be kind to yourself as you figure it out and just gravitate towards the people you like, you know.
And then someone had asked a question. I mean, we kind of touched on the reasons for the anxiety, but do you have any specific techniques as a psychiatrist that you can ways to kind of ease the anxiety with preparation for school or once you've even been there for a little bit?
Yeah, so a few things too that I thought about. I knew that question might come up, and answering would be if you're a parent who's either had your own therapy or been to therapy or you've read books about parenting, you hear this popular word validate feelings, and that's always a good place to start. But it's sort of like you hear that word and you're like, yeah, I get that, I can do that. But what does that really mean? Because actually, kids who are emotionally sensitive, this is like their medicine. They need so much validation, more than you think. And so, you know, I often will see families with a very emotionally sensitive kid, and the parent thought they were being supportive, but the kid experienced it as invalidating. So I can give an example of that. You know, if your kid is very emotional about going back to school and says something like, but nobody's going to play with me. Nobody will want to even play with me. And you might think you're being encouraging and say something like, don't be silly. That's not true. People love playing with you. And, you know, here's where there's a little trap in there, which is that the kid might feel like mom doesn't get it, or what's wrong with me? I guess that's true, but why am I feeling this way? And it kind of leaves kids a little bit alone with the feeling. So a validating comment would be something like, I hear that, you know, I can understand how when you've been away for a while or, you know, you're back to a new situation, you worry. I worry about that too. It's always good to like let kids know you've had thoughts like this. And just sit with that before going into like solution, you know, well, you could try this, or, you know, giving suggestions. That's another point in general with the pandemic is like, I think, you know, when you see your kid in distress, often the first instinct is to give advice. Like if you have a kid who's just not getting out of the house enough when we were quarantined, I would see families fighting about like, take a walk, you know? Just, you know, a little bit of that is good, but then, you know, backing off is good too. And just helping them know that you understand that this is a crummy situation.
That's so interesting. So the validating is really, it's valid that you understand where they're coming from. Not that's a great way to think about it. Yeah.
And also that validating does not. I was going to
Oh,
say,
sorry.
we're
Yeah.
breaking up again a little bit, but validating is not the same as agreeing. Like you're not,
Mm,
if you find the truth in what your kid is saying, you're not
hmm.
necessarily telling them they're right. You're just, reflecting that you see their point. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. I would think, I mean, I think the level of listening first, and so you do actually understand before validating. So it's so instead of just going straight to the validating because you know that's something you should do, but actually listening so you can really sincerely validate. I think that's an important step. And similarly, not making any assumptions about what you think they're thinking, really letting them explain themselves. I think it's pivotal in settings like this. Are there any other techniques for things that, I mean, almost get to the point where they prevent kids, like if the kids are really nervous about showing up for that first day, like to help them to get through the door even?
Um, well, you can certainly do a little visualization. The date you could talk through a visual if they're open and want to talk about it. You can talk about, okay, well, what are you picturing? Let's paint what a good day could look like, and you could
That's a
sort
good
of
idea.
talk them through your idea of how the day might go.
Hmm.
Certainly, if they're really symptomatic and like really, really upset and expressing distress, you could reach out to like a teacher they're with.
Mm-hmm.
Teachers are so great and supportive right now, and they're willing to do that. They're home.
Hmm.
Um, and you can see about a little object that they might want to have with them. You can also describe when you're going to pick them up, what you're going to do after. I,
Mm,
I don't mind. I mean, if you might want to hold off till you really have to do it, but if there's some sort of reward that you can offer for doing something hard, because this is hard,
yeah,
and
yeah.
if there's something the kid by the end of the week can get if they've really given it their best, that's a great strategy too.
Mm. I like that idea, like a visual for younger kids, a visual calendar, so they really know what the day is going to entail, and there aren't going to be surprises.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's a great idea. Um, you were mentioning yesterday when we were talking about the actual anxiety, just how you appear on the screen, which I hadn't thought about at all. But are you seeing that a bit, or I don't know if that's coming up more with the older kids, just how they're appearing on the Zoom meetings, and
Yes.
yeah,
It's a lot. It's when people tell you I hate Zoom,
yeah.
like your point, John, about really listening and don't assume. Um, Ask your kid, what do you hate about Zoom? And I
Mm,
bet often it's this like feeling watched, especially in adolescence when you're kind of trying to build your self-esteem, you're trying to figure out your image, you're working on your acne. Here they are being like, you know, close up on the face, um, it's uncomfortable. It's distracting. It's highly. Is there anything more distracting than thinking about ourselves and our
yeah,
own ego?
yeah,
No. So it's hard.
yeah.
I tell kids to really find if there's a feature where you can hide your image. I know it's like some kids don't want to do that because they want to check and they want to make sure they look good, you know, I'm like just as a form of self-discipline, like just
Mm,
consider hiding it because you got to focus on what they're saying. Yeah.
mm. Yeah, that's an excellent idea. I think back to high school when you're so nervous about how you look, but you can actually see if people are watching you. The idea of doing this on a Zoom call where you have no idea who's watching you when, I think could be quite maddening.
It is. And
So
then I had a college kid recently tell me that the one in-person class she has is in a dance studio with mirrors.
there's no way out. That's
No
pretty
way
funny.
out. Yeah.
Um, and then, well, let me see, any other things that you wanted to mention? I have some other questions, but
Um, sure. I mean, I could talk a little bit about, when you were saying the idea of our own modeling and what we're
hmm.
modeling to kids, which kind of we're doing with our own stress level as parents.
Hmm.
Yes, keeping a positive tone in front of your kid is a very good idea. Um, and you know, so when you talk about things like the way that school has set up their safety procedures, you want to give the kid a sense that you think the school's doing a really good job, that even if you have some criticisms, just like the adults are working really hard to make this a safe place. You're in good. Um, and but that doesn't mean that we have to never show our stress. I think one of the key ingredients to like building resilience in children, which a lot of people are writing about right now, because these kids are having such a unique experience, and it's going to be really interesting to see, how this affects their development. But is that they do need to see their parents having a hard time and then getting through the day, because it shows you can have both. I think if a parent is really acutely dysregulated or weeping, or that can be a little scary. So, showing a hard time doesn't necessarily mean when you're angry. But so take those moments to like pull yourself together, but being able to show your kid that you're really stressed and sad about what's happening in the world too, and we're still gonna, cook dinner and watch our favorite show. It's just, that's how they'll learn to be strong.
And you mean more as like a conversation with a child, or just kind of not being so stoic in terms of how you express your emotions? Because I guess you can do it either way. But
can you say that again? Sorry.
Well, I mean, there's one way where you could sit down and talk to your child and say, hey, these are tough times, and I'm nervous myself. Or is it the kind of thing where just in the moment you let yourself get a little emotional if you're crying or whatever it's going to be? Are those both kind of two different elements to kind of present you're going through a hard time? Or
yeah,
like, I don't know that yeah.
Go ahead. What
I'm
were you
trying to
going to
think
say?
that in terms of age, though. Like at what age could you feel like you could sit down with a child and say, this is hard for me too, and kind of talk it through in a way where it would be constructive for a child to see? Or maybe that's not the right way to go.
I mean, no, I think you're right. You tailor it to your child's developmental level. So if you've lost it for a minute, whether teared up or you lost your temper, to an adolescent, you might say more, but to a younger kid, you might say something like, I'm sorry, I'm feeling a little emotional today. There's so much going on, and sometimes I feel sad about it. And I'm just glad we have each other, and let's think of ways we can do something fun tonight, or yeah.
That's a great. I mean, the other thing I always think is important about that is to wait until you're not emotional or your child's not emotional to have that conversation, so you can really sink in there, as opposed to having it immediately after, when they might not be as receptive to hearing what you're thinking. I always find having a little bit of a gap so you can kind of compose yourself and talk about it's important as well.
Me too.
I think that's a great advice. Gene, do you feel like this is different from the anxiety back in March and April? Like, because now I feel like it is kind of a new norm. And I think back in April, we were all kind of hiding behind, it's going to be okay, we'll get through this, it'll be over, blah, blah, blah. Now I feel like it's a different response. It's like, this is the new norm. It's okay. It's different, but it's okay. But I feel like that sense of reassurance that it just feels differently about this heading into fall, differently than I spoke to folks at the beginning of the pandemic. I don't know if you feel it differently, or am I just kind of making things up here?
Some of you got a little cut off, but I heard the bulk of that, which is that, I guess I agree with that. I think people are at a different psychologically about whether they've accepted this as a new norm or not. There's still hope, obviously, that a lot of what we are familiar with is going to come back. So it's less about, now this is our entire new normal, and more about, this is a game of stamina. This is like, wow, this is really going on. This is a marathon. How do I keep my stamina? At the beginning, it was more like the initial shock, which almost, in psychiatric terms, when you're going through an initial kind of like shocking trauma of some kind, you almost have a more dissociative state. Like you're just like, whoa, exactly. And kind of like feeling not centered.
Oops, I lost you there. Yeah. Oh, you're breaking up a little bit. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, okay. So
Oh,
that's
no, I
another
lost you again.
way.
There you go. Try it again. Yeah.
That's another way it's a little different. Um, so what are you finding, John, that you said that there, I think you said something about that what you end up talking with patients about now is like of a different content.
Yeah, I mean, I think in before, I think there was always the idea that we're going through a traumatic experience and we're going to get through this and we're going to be back to how things were to a certain extent. That was kind of the gist of the conversation, which might not have been correct, but that's kind of seemed to land. Now I feel like the conversation is, you know what, it's impressive how everybody's um, adjusting to the new normal, and it's more of a situation of not saying we're going back as much as kind of validating people's ability to play and letting them be like it's okay for it to be different and it doesn't have to go back to being the old normal. We can find a new way that's going to be just as good. So it's more of like an active thing of searching out what's new and what's new, but it's going to think about how to get to a kind of a moving endpoint, if that makes any sense. But that's how I tend to think about it now. Um,
What I think parents, as a parent myself, and just when people ask questions about what's going to have changed in the world, I would ask you, like from a public health standpoint, um, what do you think could stick around in terms of all of these new precautions people are taking for infectious disease? I'm just curious.
I mean, I think unfortunately, like everything else in this country, there's such a divide in terms of people's perception of what's real and what's not real. Speaking for New York, I feel as though it was bad here in April, and I think people really have not so much of a theoretical sense of germ theory and the ability for a pandemic, but there's a real sense that these precautions that we take are effective. So I do feel like the people might be wearing masks, like you've seen around the world. You might see masks just frequently, and I think people are going to be much more careful about about kind of how they interact with other people. I think we're all going to fumble along to find our way. And one thing that I find, which is it's hard to explain, but there's such a dis people have such different feelings of risk versus of what they want to accomplish that everyone is going to have to figure that out as an individual, and that's going to lead us to some collective new endpoint. And I don't know where that's going to be, but I think for New York, and I take my hat off to New York for this one, or I guess I take my mask off to New York for this one. But it seems like I think we're going to end up in a place where everyone's more responsible in understanding that these public health measures really make a difference. So that's where I think we'll end
Yeah.
up, and I think our kids will grow up with this being something that's going to be etched into their mind, and there's going to be a lot more respect for the need to take these precautions. So I think the next generation is going to be very responsible in that regard. Again, I can only speak for New York. I don't have as much of a sense of the rest of the country,
Yeah.
but
Yep.
that's why I live in New
Yep.
York. One other thing, Jeannie, I'm always, I mean, I'm so old in relation to the various generations of things on the internet, but how does that impact kids now in this world where they're not seeing each other in school? Like, I just feel like the internet has such an impact on anxiety and how kids feel they are socially. In this world where they're no longer interacting in school quite as much, did it take on a bigger role? Was it always so big that it's just there?
Um, Boy, I hope I'm not breaking up as much as you, because I heard you say, can you specify, you were saying kids are so much more exposed anyway, line life, and what was the question?
Well, I feel like, I mean, not having grown up with it, I don't have a sense on it, a sense of just how important it is. But in a world now where kids aren't going and interacting together in school, I just wonder if it takes on even more import and if that's going to lead to even more trouble in terms of anxiety and possibly bullying? Or has it always been such a big part of life anyway that it's not going to be any different?
Oh, I see. Well, one thing I'll say about this gen fact that they've been asked now to spend so much time online. I have a lot of thoughts about that. In many ways, I'm very grateful to the online community
Hmm.
because being alone, I totally respect and don't make any parent feel guilty who's let their kid play more video games because that is such a center of social connection. And yay. Do you know what I mean? Yay, especially now. Like, I mean, these kids have fun together online.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, is it the same as in person? No. And depending on the kid, they will, some kids um, are not, they're so crazy of social connection all the time, and they kind of like that level of social connection. Other kids will tell
Mm.
you, oh, that's different from my IRL friends, my in real life friends. You know,
Yeah.
that's fun. It's not going to be the same. So I have felt reassured overall that, like, you know, the
Oh, good,
fundamental
good.
human things that we need, like feeling close to people, feeling loved, that's still what kids want, and
Mm.
they still don't think it's as good online. What can I say?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I totally, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I guess the last question I have is, I kind of feel like there's the import of the weekend and the family time and the person time. It probably becomes just that much more important now, given the way that our weeks are so variable and different than what we typically expect. Is there a sense of like really understanding that weekend is almost like a return to normalcy, or an island between these weeks where
Yeah.
you're trying to figure things out?
That depends on the family structure
That's a good
a
point.
bit because um and the time of year. I think summer was
Hmm.
different from school. But if we're talking about the school year, let's say we're talking about like kids who are doing school from home,
Hmm.
and is there a sense of weekends being different? And is, you know, how do you kind of keep that? How do you keep healthy family time?
Mm.
Um, is that sounding like your
Yeah,
question?
that's kind of where
Yeah.
I'm. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think that you know, it's harder to make the weekends feel super different from the weeks if you're
Yeah.
all home together, if you're all working home together. I think usually when we as a family, you know, try to have special family time because we've had time apart, right? It's because your kids
Mm.
have been at school, you've been at work. Now let's come home and let's have a concentrated family dinner, let's bond. But when you're kind of like with each other all day long, in some cases less needed, but
Hmm.
definitely feels maybe a little less special and sometimes you can take for granted. And so I think that something to keep in mind in your house is like, if depending on the age of your kid, if
Mm.
they're doing school and you're doing work, let
Mm.
that existence. You don't
Exactly.
feel guilty about not spending the day together. You know, like if they're in their room a lot of the time, let them do their thing. You do your thing. Deserve that sense of like concentrated family time here and there. It's not going
Yeah.
to feel as intense as it was, but I think you have to kind of, it's less about actually preserving family time and it's more now about preserving some space
That's a
between you
great
and your
point. Yeah. Yeah.
kids. Yeah.
I think, well, I guess what I was getting at more is like I like the idea almost like a ritual. Like there's a time that is a time that you kind of know is special family time that you can expect, because it might allow you a little bit more um, comfort with the idea of being separate, or just spending time in the same place without being together. If you know that you're going to have that kind of ritualized time together that you can anticipate, I think it makes the other time a little bit easier. So that's just something that I always find useful.
Yes, I agree with
Yeah,
that. And there are
yeah,
fun things to do right now in the city low, you know,
that
there's
is true.
things you
Yeah.
can plan.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Um, well, I think this is great. I mean, I feel like the idea of validation in and of itself, I think, is such a huge point. I think just giving parents the ability to have that when they're listening to their child instead of having to jump at action is just it's just a huge take home point.
Good. Yeah.
It sound is totally worth it. And if people have questions, I'll kind of shoot them through to you, and we'll get back to them that way.
Okay, I'm sorry about our connection, John. I hope that the video
That's
comes
all
out
good.
decently.
I think so. Like I said, the words are. I think we're good. I think we're great.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Bye.